As the war in Vietnam escalates, so does protest against it. Much of the anger is focused on President Lyndon Johnson. It becomes the most violent dissent in America since the Civil War. President Johnson steps down, but public bitterness spreads. May 1970. On a small town campus, the Vietnam War comes home to America. At Kent State University, National Guardsmen open fire on protesters. 4 students die. During the Nixon presidency, America is divided over Vietnam as never before. October 67. The march on the Pentagon culminates a year of rising protest over Vietnam. More than 50,000 gather. It is the first of many anti-war marches against the federal government. And it brings together the diverse elements of the peace movement: pacifists, communists, black militants, students, and professors. Their only point of agreement: stop the war in Vietnam. The Pentagon protest has 2 main factions: the pacifists and the student activists, led by Jerry Rubin.
We had to create the image of a massive outpouring of public reaction against the war aimed at the Pentagon. I believe the Pentagon demonstration was the turning point in the anti-war effort. I believe it was the most important demonstration that took place in the entire decade against the war, including Chicago. I believed it captured the imagination of young people, and my idea was that the anti-war movement had to be daring, had to be bold, had to be confrontational, had to really grab the imagination of the country. And so we said we're going to close down the Pentagon, no halfway measures.
As the huge protest march begins, the pacifist group tries to keep order. The militants, however, are prepared for violence. Jerry Rubin.
The only way this war is going to end is if we have war in the streets. And when people see there's going to be war in the streets of America, then they're going to stop dropping bombs on Vietnam 10,000 miles away to stop the war at home. I hope to build a mass movement that would reach into every level of American society, that would use Vietnam as a model for understanding what social changes are needed at home. So I saw the anti-war struggle as a moral crusade to wake up the slumbering morality that exists in all of us and that exists in this country. If the Vietnam War did not exist, we would have had to create it.
Lyndon Johnson told the nation, have no fear of escalation. I am trying everyone to flee.
10,000 police, National Guardsmen, and soldiers assembled to protect the Pentagon. The troops carry tear gas and heavy truncheons, but their rifles are not loaded. The demonstrators are beaten back from the Pentagon's main entrance. Close to 1,000 are arrested during the weekend confrontation. The Johnson administration sees the peace movement as prolonging the war. Secretary of State Dean Rusk.
If we had seen 50,000 people demonstrating around the headquarters in Hanoi calling for peace, we would have thought the war was over, and we would have been right. But they could see 50,000 people demonstrating around the Pentagon in Washington. So what conclusions would they draw from that? I think there were those who persuaded them not to come to the conference table, not to try to find a peaceful solution, but to persist and win politically what they could not win militarily. And in that judgment, it turned out they were right.
The fear of domestic violence rallies the public behind President Johnson. Pacifist leader David Dellinger is disappointed.
At that time, there was a crisis of confidence within the movement. We didn't shut down the Pentagon. The war was continuing, and a lot of people began to think we didn't have the power that we should have.
By late '67, nearly 500,000 U.S. troops are in Vietnam. 16,000 Americans have died in combat. The U.S. increases pressure on North Vietnam and now bombs industrial targets close to the cities. Dellinger visits North Vietnam.
The theory was that they were bombing only steel and concrete, that it was a surgical war, that they were, maintaining humanitarian standards. When I got over there, I found out that churches, schools, hospitals, houses, entire villages were being wiped out. People just discovered that the United States was fighting an entirely different kind of war than it claimed, and it was violating all of the international laws of war.
President Johnson responds.
I understand the feelings of those who regret that we must undertake air attacks. I share those feelings. We have carefully limited those raids. They've been directed at concrete and steel, and not human life.
I brought back, for example, an anti-personnel bomb. Each of them released these little pellets, which were absolutely useless against steel and concrete, to use Johnson's phrase, and were only good against people.
Prominent anti-war activists are invited to North Vietnam. Their accounts of civilian destruction fuel the growing anti-war movement. This is part of Hanoi's strategy. North Vietnamese diplomat Ha Van Lao.
We consider the anti-war movement in the United States to be one of the important factors which helped us to win the victory and end the war.
America's traditional allies turn against it over Vietnam. The British Labour government is mildly critical, but militants riot outside the U.S. Embassy. In France, both government and public strongly oppose a war they abandoned 13 years earlier. December '67. President Johnson visits Australia, which has 8,000 combat troops in Vietnam. But anti-war feeling confronts Johnson wherever he goes. Internationally, the war is seen as a David and Goliath struggle, with the world cheering David. The hostility of its friends sharpens America's internal divisions. In Congress, the influential chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee urges peace, Senator William Fulbright.
Well, I made up my mind a good while ago that I do not think that the vital interest of the United States is involved in Vietnam, and that the wise course for this country to take is to seek a political settlement.
The president is increasingly intolerant of opposition and removes advisors who question his policies. Fulbright is shunned.
The president, of course, made public speeches. I was there one day out at the Armory when I wasn't any farther from here than I am to you. And that was when he used the phrase, the nervous Nellies and the Sunshine Patriots, and no one stand up to support the president, and everybody hoops and hollered, and you were made to look like a traitor, in effect.
Parades to support the war become as frequent as the protests. Most Americans fear that the anti-war movement may encourage much wider racial and social unrest. The war divides the churches. Two Catholic priests, the Berrigan brothers, become national anti-war leaders. Father Daniel Berrigan.
We are ready for more jail and more trials and more conspiracy indictments. And this not because we are grown cynical or interiorly violent ourselves, but because we look upon Caesar with a skeptical and temperate and mature eye of the Christian.
Black leaders swing the powerful civil rights movement against the war. They charge that black soldiers are fighting and dying in disproportionate numbers. Militant Stokely Carmichael.
There is no need to go to Vietnam and shoot somebody who a honky says is your enemy. We're going to shoot the cops who are shooting our black brothers in the back in this country. That's where we're going.
But when I die, I'm going to die with my boots on, and it's going to be in this country. And it's going to be fighting for what I know is right, the liberation of black people, nothing else, nothing else. And what we're going to say across this country, from Muhammad Ali to the little black boy in Cardozo High School, hell no, we won't go.
(1968). Vietnam's distant battles reach closer to America. The U.S. command in Vietnam wants 670,000 troops and wants mobilization of civilian reserves. Anti-war protest increases as more and more young Americans are personally affected by the draft. The call-up reaches into small towns for younger men. In Westchester, California, 19-year-old Larry Francis has returned his draft card as a protest. The Army then speeds his call-up. This is the day he is supposed to report for induction. His friends gather to encourage him.
In his hands he's got Larry Francis. In his hands he's got...
He is supported by his parents.
In his hands he's got the whole world in his hands.
Larry Francis tells his local draft board that he won't go to Vietnam. Thousands choose prison rather than register for service.
And the way we're messing ourselves up shows in many ways. It shows in the fact that at this very moment, 500,000 of our friends and our brothers are killing and dying in a jungle 10,000 miles away. And it shows in those cards we all carry in our pockets. Well, I'm finished. I'm a free man today.
But I ain't marching anymore. It's always the old who lead us to the wars, always the young to fall. But I ain't marching anymore. No, I ain't marching anymore.
A celebrity who successfully fights the draft on religious terms. Boxing champion Muhammad Ali.
I'd rather face machine gun fire before deviate from the teachings of Almighty God and the religion of Islam. I would die.
Ali says he would go down fighting rather than go to Vietnam or to jail.
I'm not saying where I will go. I'm just letting you know that I'm going to stick 1,000% to my religious beliefs, even if it means die. You figure out the rest.
Men attending university cannot be called into the military, so American universities are the heart of the anti-war cause. Some who join the campus protesters bring world attention. Joan Baez with her songs, husband David Harris by going to jail.
It was grossly unfair, and if America was going to fight wars, you know, white college kids ought to fight them every bit as much as blacks and Chicanos. So my first act was to refuse to accept the student deferment, and failing all other things, to have left the country. But my feeling was it was my country, and that if anybody ought to leave, I thought Lyndon Johnson should be the one leaving, not me.
Harris serves 20 months of a 2-year sentence.
Well, I did more time than any of the Watergate people except Howard Hunt and Gordon Liddy. The real criminals of that period never did any time.
40,000 draft dodgers and deserters leave America. 30,000 go to Canada, where many will stay on years after the war. By 1968, American combat deaths exceed 1,000 a month. A senior Democrat decides to oppose President Johnson and seek the presidency on an anti-war ticket. Senator Eugene McCarthy.
I said that the opposition to the war would begin to develop when they were sending bodies back, not to Louisville, Kentucky, and Memphis and New York, but when they begin to come back into towns of 5 or 10,000 or smaller communities, that these are historic events in a town of that size, and so-and-so's son has been brought back dead and been buried here. As the death rate and the injury rate grew, there was, I think, a very gradual growth of opposition. And then the media sort of began to cover it. Life began to print whole pages of pictures of the people who had died in Vietnam. And you say be 100 or 200, I've forgotten how many on a page, that the public began to look at what was happening to persons. And I concluded that the only way you could do anything about it was to really take it to the public. And I said, well, really the only way you can do it is to challenge Johnson.
McCarthy enters the primaries with the polls giving him only a few % of the vote. Johnson appears invulnerable. Then the war takes a dramatic turn. January '68, the communist Tet Offensive sweeps across Vietnam. Television brings the month-long fight for the cities of Vietnam into the living rooms of America and brings the first widespread doubts. Even President Johnson's close aides advise him to get out of Vietnam. Except for secure military bases, Johnson faces hostile crowds almost everywhere he travels. McCarthy's presidential campaign is now galvanized by voter discontent over the war. McCarthy's primary victories encouraged Robert Kennedy to enter the presidential race on an anti-war ticket.
1960s or the 1950s.
Opinion polls show that 63% of the public oppose President Johnson's Vietnam commitment. Lyndon Johnson took America to war in Vietnam, but those close to him see him as a president reluctantly drawn into war. Secretary of State Dean Rusk.
Except for the men who carried the battle and their families, no one agonized over Vietnam more than Lyndon Johnson did. There was so much that he wanted to accomplish in such time as he had, and so many things were barred to him by the problems of Vietnam. So I think that this was the inherited burden which he had to carry, which he would have been glad to do without.
Johnson is also portrayed as a leader who became overly influenced by his advisors and by his need for public approval. His biographer, Doris Kearns.
Simply put, at the bottom of everything, Johnson needed to be liked by people. You could see it in his face when he walked in a room. Despite that overbearing dominance, there was that sense of, please like me, I'm going to give you a gift. And he did. He gave gifts of the Great Society, the civil rights laws. Even in Vietnam, he thought he could couple with all the bombing and the damage to the fabric of that country. He really assumed that somehow he'd bring this massive foreign aid program over there and he'd rebuild Vietnam. But you just have to remember Johnson's perception of his own past. Always he'd been the master of the behind-the-door bargainer. And obviously he was misestimating what happens during a war, number one, and the whole nature of modern media. Those television cameras were over there every day. When people saw that war happening in their screens every night, they weren't going to forget it the way he had hoped they would.
In the Oval Office, as in American homes, Vietnam becomes a living room war. And increasingly, the public demands an end.
Good evening, my fellow Americans.
March 31st, 1968. Johnson tells a stunned nation he is stepping down.
Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
So when LBJ came on and shocked all of us by saying I shall not run for re-election, we knew then that we were in the driver's seat, that we were in the 60s the driving force in society, and that we were going to drive home the point that you cannot treat poor people, blacks, Vietnamese, without any humanity and have a safe and secure home yourself.
Spring 1968. First, Martin Luther King is assassinated, then Robert Kennedy. The violent deaths of the two leading anti-war moderates is followed by political chaos on a scale unknown since the Civil War. The black ghettos erupt across America. The anti-war protests are larger and more violent. One Washington protest is contained by 15,000 troops, more than are engaged in any battle in Vietnam. August 68. 10,000 anti-war demonstrators converge on Chicago for the Democratic Convention. Half are supporters of presidential candidate McCarthy, but a militant faction announces it will disrupt the convention. 26,000 police, troops, and National Guardsmen, 2 for each demonstrator, are assembled by Chicago's Mayor Daley.
This administration, our administration, and the people of Chicago have never and will condone brutality at any time, but they will never permit a lawless, violent group of terrorists to menace the lives of millions of people, destroy the purpose of this national convention, and take over the streets of Chicago.
But first we rallied in Grant Park in Chicago, and early in the rally, a bloodied, beaten up demonstrator shinnied up the flagpole and replaced the American flag with his bloody shirt. He said, let the world see that that is what's happening in Chicago. But when that happened, that became a signal for the police to charge the crowd. And I shall never forget them.
They're a pitiful handful. They have almost no support, but by golly, they get the cooperation of the news media. They're built into something really big. They're referred to as kids. They're referred to as yippies. Gentlemen, the hardcore leadership of this group are communists.
By forcing the government to overreact at home, we were, in a sense, spotlighting to the American people the overreaction of America overseas. Chicago was an education for the American people about Vietnam and about oppression in the ghettos and about just the whole use of physical force to solve social problems.
The anti-war movement has no presidential candidate. Robert Kennedy is dead. McCarthy lacks popular support. The Chicago protest is to express frustration. As the marchers move through downtown Chicago, the police charge. A government report later describes the event as a police riot. Television scenes convey the sense of a nation destroying itself. "800 demonstrators are injured, some seriously."
There was no proportion between numbers and no proportion between what the police and the military did and what the threat to them was. It was sort of waiting to charge, and when there was no provocation, they charged anyway. And we set up the hospital just to bring these people in and sew them up.
Trying to fend off some of the blows. I came back up, and they said, "Get out of here." And I said, "I'm trying to." In which case, they hit me again, and hit me again.
So that was sort of the whole mood of the convention. Unjustified, unnecessary violence and oppression and abuse by the police and the National Guard.
With Vice President Hubert Humphrey nominated, McCarthy delegates hold a candlelight requiem. As one delegate put it, This convention tonight elected Richard Nixon. The Vietnam War will last 4 more years. An historian later said, in 1968, America lived through more history than it could digest.
I, Richard Milhous Nixon, do solemnly swear
that you will faithfully...
January 1969. Richard M. Nixon is sworn in as America's 37th president.
President of the United States.
President of the United States.
And will, to the best of your ability...
Nixon's promise to achieve peace in Vietnam has helped him win office, but it takes 4 years with ever-increasing conflict in America.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
Lyndon Johnson leaves the framework for withdrawal. He has initiated peace talks. Nixon describes his policy as peace with honor, but he does not reveal his plans. Nixon inherits serious domestic dissent. This now increases. Nixon's Vietnam policy is to get, not make concessions. His senior domestic aide, John Ehrlichman.
Well, his position was that he'd been elected as the individual under the constitutional system responsible for the conduct of foreign policy and the waging of war, if you please, and that foreign policy just couldn't be made in the streets.
The popular media begins to question the war. But Nixon will not be hurried. He scorns the demonstrators, calling them mindless rioters and professional malcontents.
He reacted, he recoiled, he resisted. But beyond that, he deliberately set about to build a consensus in the country in support of his foreign policy and his conduct of the war. And this was not just a political thing, but he had people like Charles Colson out organizing hard hats and organizing labor unions and organizing American Legion posts to come to the president and say, Mr. President, we support you.
Nixon believes he can win consensus and peace on his terms. He relies on strong presidential image. He sees himself defending American honor and what he calls the square virtues. Peace must not smack of defeat. Having stood firm at home, he now secretly applies the same pressure on North Vietnam. Hanoi's leaders pursue the same talk-fight strategy. As the peace negotiations drag out, the North Vietnamese increase troop infiltration through neighboring Cambodia. March 69. Nixon retaliates. He extends the bombing to Cambodia. To avoid more public criticism, Nixon orders that the bombing be kept secret. South Vietnam's president, Nguyen Van Thieu, has long been advocating this action.
Oh, frankly, if we have had enough means to destroy the war potential of the North Vietnamese communists in Laos and in Cambodia, I would have done that because it would help to shorten the war and to economize the blood and the human life.
Almost 500,000 bombs are dropped. The communist supply sanctuaries along the Cambodian border shelter an estimated 40,000 North Vietnamese troops. The U.S. air attacks are justified, says Defense Secretary Melvin Laird.
Well, I was for hitting the sanctuaries at that time in Cambodia, the sanctuaries that were completely controlled by the North Vietnamese. My disagreement with Secretary Kissinger and the President of the United States was over the fact that they insisted on keeping these strikes secret. I said with 16,000 people involved, you could not keep them secret.
News of the bombing brings public uproar, but Nixon is prepared. May 69. Nixon proposes withdrawal of American and communist forces within 1 year of a peace treaty, but there is no agreement. Hanoi wants the U.S. to stop supporting President Thieu. Both sides begin to ignore the formal peace talks.
I believe that Secretary Kissinger and President Nixon felt that there was an opportunity to work out a peaceful accord between the North and the South. I think that they were somewhat disillusioned as negotiations progressed, but I believe they entered into these negotiations with a great deal of confidence that they could have some sort of success.
June '69. Nixon meets President Chu on Midway Island. After talks, Nixon announces the gradual withdrawal of U.S. troops. He assures Chu that South Vietnam will be safeguarded.
I trust completely on him, as he could support for a long time the cause of freedom of the Vietnamese people.
In a letter to Ho Chi Minh, Nixon proposes secret negotiations. He sets a 4-month deadline for a settlement under the threat of more bombing. Ho Chi Minh's response is called a cold rebuff. A few weeks later, Ho dies. Hanoi remains confident the U.S. will tire of the war first. Summer '69. New anti-war protest by Vietnam veterans angers Nixon. He sees it destroying his credibility with Hanoi. The pressure increases. The anti-war movement announces a national demonstration for October 15th, coinciding with Nixon's secret deadline to Hanoi. Hanoi maintains silence. But in a letter to demonstration organizers, Prime Minister Pham Van Dong says, "May your fall offensive succeed splendidly." As October 15th approaches, Nixon is confident the majority of Americans support him.
His response to that, in-house, was to say, look, that's a tiny fraction of the American people out there. It's on all the television, the media are killing us with it, but we know that the vast majority of Americans are with us. And so we can't let that rule or govern what we do.
For Nixon, as for Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, Vietnam is a test of American credibility.
He often said, you know, it would be the easiest thing in the world for me simply to order our troops out of there. But if I did, then none of our allies could ever count on the United States' word again.
February 1970, Nixon promises durable peace.
We are making progress toward that goal. The prospects for peace are far greater today than they were a year ago.
The North Vietnamese continue to use Cambodia as their main staging area for attacks on the South. Nixon now decides on the most dramatic step since U.S. combat involvement, an invasion of Cambodia. South Vietnamese forces will advance west of Saigon into the Parrot's Beak. A U.S.-led force will strike at a sanctuary called the Fish Hook. 15,000 American troops assemble. Nixon has said it would be his policy to issue a warning only once. He has now warned Hanoi. He tells the public that the United States must act or seem like a helpless giant. He chooses May Day, the traditional communist holiday. The Fish Hook jungle is believed to contain the communist regional headquarters. The Americans begin a prolonged search, but do not find it. The American thrust extends 20 miles, but the communists slip away. The operation is a disappointment, but the military claims it is hindered by political restrictions. Nixon's Chief of Staff, General Alexander Haig.
If I were to be critical of it, I would say that there were too many definitive limitations applied in the conduct of the announcement of the decision to go in there, both in terms of duration and scope of American activity on the ground in Cambodia.
The South Vietnamese advance extends into populated areas. The bombing and fighting leave an estimated 200,000 refugees. In Washington, Nixon anticipates a violent political reaction.
Would there be demonstrations in Washington? Would there be all this in the street? He said, if there were, pointing to me, he said, you're going to have to handle it. He said, I cannot be distracted by that during this period of time. So he said, I want you to think through what you might have to do in terms of police and National Guard and all that sort of thing. We didn't anticipate Kent State, obviously.
May 2nd, 1970. As the troops advance into Cambodia, American campuses explode in protest. At Kent State University in Ohio, National Guardsmen fire into a crowd.
The Guardsmen marched back up on top of the hill and turned and just, and then yelled their live bullets because, there's a car window shattered. And this guy says, I got this girl shot, and he picks her up, and she has this bloody spot on her jacket, and there's blood coming out of her mouth. And I just sort of ran. I felt I should have stayed and helped her, but I was afraid.
11 students are wounded, 4 killed. Nixon's reaction.
Look, I can't let this affect how I conduct this thing. And the reasons we're in Cambodia are that this was a sanctuary, and the North Vietnamese were beating up our people, and we had to get in there and root them out, and so on.
In 1971, the war closes in on Nixon. U.S. troops continue to withdraw, even though Saigon's troops are being methodically defeated. Then comes military disgrace. Lieutenant William Calley is found guilty of the mass murder of Vietnamese civilians. Nixon tries to save image and honor in a speech at West Point.
Through a long and bitter struggle in Vietnam, American fighting men have served the cause of freedom magnificently. And the American people have stood behind our commitment to the people of South Vietnam in the face of great temptations to turn aside.
In 1971, former State Department official Daniel Ellsberg releases a secret Pentagon analysis of the war.
I had the feeling that America was eating its young, was destroying some of its most dedicated, most patriotic, most concerned citizens, young Americans subject to the draft. And that it was up to older people like me, who had been participants, not to let that burden fall entirely on their children and on that generation.
The Pentagon Papers reveal seeming deception, even lying by government officials. Although the papers deal mainly with the actions of Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, it is Nixon who must live with the disclosures.
Ray Conniff and his very famous choral group will now entertain us. And if the music is square, it's because I like it square.
Events close in even at the White House.
President Nixon, stop bombing human beings, animals, and vegetation. You go to church on Sundays and pray to Jesus Christ. If Jesus Christ were here tonight, you would not dare drop another bomb. Bless the Berrigans and bless Daniel Ellsberg.
He's making eyes at me. Ma, he's awfully nice to me. Ma, he's almost breaking my heart. I'm beside him. Mercy, let his conscience guide him. Ma, he wants to marry me. Be my husband.
Nixon founded tours GI bases.
Nixon is telling us one thing and he's doing something else. He is trying to create an unseen war. That's what Vietnamization is all about. You know, Ellsworth Bunker calls it changing the color of the corpses. He thinks that as long as he can remove the war from the minds of the American people, while it's inflicting more damage on the bodies of the Vietnamese people, that we can be pacified.
She visits Hanoi to denounce the war. More American celebrities follow her, including Joan Baez, who sings during the bombing.
Save the children, Lord, Kumbaya. Save the children, Lord.
Spring '72. Hanoi challenges Nixon as never before. It invades across the partition line. It is North Vietnam's largest conventional attack. Nixon's secret peace talks have lasted 3 years. Only 100,000 U.S. troops remain in Vietnam. He orders massive B-52 bombing of the North. The U.S. mines North Vietnam's ports, but Hanoi still refuses concessions. North Vietnamese troops press south, capturing the border region. The American field commander cables that South Vietnam is crumbling, but U.S. air power halts the communist advance. July '72. Kissinger's secret negotiations are racing the clock. Nixon wants a peace agreement before the November election. The breakthrough comes in mid-October. Nixon concedes that 150,000 communist troops already in the South can remain. Hanoi stops insisting Thieu must go. Nixon and Kissinger have 4 weeks left to sell the deal to Thieu. Kissinger leaves immediately for Saigon. President Thieu now hears the peace terms for the first time. He angrily rejects them. But Kissinger nevertheless proclaims peace is at hand. In the U.S., Nixon's campaign rides with the peace fever. Just back from Moscow, he proclaims the Cold War is over. Nixon wins in a landslide. Days later, Kissinger and Hanoi's chief negotiator meet in Paris. Kissinger has overcome Saigon's objections, but now Hanoi delays on technical details. The talks break down. Nixon decides on maximum force to end the war. December 1972. For the first time, Hanoi is bombed continuously. Hanoi vilifies Nixon. A peace settlement follows the controversial bombing. Nixon's defenders say the peace brings a new international stability. President Nixon's Vietnam decisions are linked to a wider foreign policy.
His whole Vietnam experience has to be evaluated in relation to Russia and China and America's allies. Everything relates to everything else in this. And while negotiations were going on with China, while negotiations were going on with the Russians over salt and these other things, Vietnam was a kind of a stage where America's bona fides, our intentions, our motives were being acted out. We were being loyal to an ally. We were committed to a consistent foreign policy. These things all meant things to the French, they meant things to the Japanese, they meant things to, obviously, to the Vietnamese, but they particularly meant things to the Russians and the Chinese. And when Henry would talk to those people, or when the president would talk to them, Vietnam was always a subject of conversation, and it was always discussed in the larger context, in that sort of global context, rather than in the rather narrow contexts in which sometimes the debate raged in this country.
Through the Johnson-Nixon years, Americans have differing interpretations of patriotism. activists believe they contribute to a better society. Jerry Rubin.
In the year 2000, without a doubt, we're going to look back at the 60s and say that the people who represented George Washington and Thomas Paine and the real patriotism of America were the people who were opposing the war, because the war was against America's interests. It hurt America. It was not in America's interest to go to Vietnam. So I felt throughout the whole war period that I was a patriot, a nationalist, fighting for America. Had America been able to win the war in Vietnam, America would have stomped in there and conquered that country, and the American people would have gone behind the war. But because, fortunately, America could not win, the soul of America got challenged, and America had to really face its own soul and come to terms with defeat.
How many men must die to justify...
What did happen, I think, was that the people running the war were left without any moral justification. It would be a long time before a president will assume automatically, as they did in the past, that they both had the right to this kind of moral support for a war in Congress and out, or that they would get it. And that may be the most significant historical result of the whole anti-war movement.
I think the real decision to bring this to an end was not made on college campuses or in the streets, but when people at the grassroots, maybe the first half of 1968, came to the conclusion that if we could not tell them when this struggle was going to be over, we might as well chuck it.
In Vietnam, to a unique extent, the troops and public are influenced by each other's doubts and confusion.
I received your letter here today, but I don't understand the things you say. You tell me there are people marching in our streets. The signs they carry say that we don't fight for peace. There's not a soldier in this foreign land who likes this war. Oh, Mama, tell them what we're fighting for.